There is a photograph I asked NASA to take. I had to argue for it. Many of my colleagues thought it a waste of mission resources, pointing the Voyager camera backward toward the inner solar system to photograph a planet we already knew. But I believed, and still believe, that what we needed was not more data. What we needed was perspective. And so on February 14, 1990, from a distance of nearly 6 billion kilometers, the camera turned. And there, in a scattered ray of sunlight, was Earth. A pale blue dot, barely a pixel, almost nothing. I wrote at the time that every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, every inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived out their lives on that mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. But there was something I did not say loudly enough. Something I had been trying to say for years, in papers and lectures and books that I feared were not reaching the people who most needed to read them. On that same pale blue dot, at the very moment that photograph was taken, there were approximately 60,000 nuclear warheads, armed and allocated, pointed at human cities. We had built, with extraordinary ingenuity and at tremendous cost, the precise mechanism required to end our civilization, and we had aimed it at ourselves. I want to speak to you now not as a narrator of history, but as someone who lived through that era with open eyes and a growing terror that the rest of the world had somehow learned to look away. I spent years studying what scientists called nuclear winter. Together with my colleagues, Richard Turco, Brian Toon, Thomas Ackerman, James Pollock, we published research in 1983 that modeled the atmospheric consequences of large-scale nuclear exchange. The results were not what anyone wanted to hear. The fires alone, the burning of cities, of forests, and of fuel depots across the northern hemisphere, would inject enough soot and particulate matter into the stratosphere to block sunlight for months, perhaps longer. Temperatures would plummet. Agriculture would collapse. The indirect deaths, from starvation, from the failure of the systems that feed billions of people, would dwarf the direct casualties of the blasts themselves. We called it nuclear winter. The name was clinical. The reality it described was the end of complex civilization on Earth. I testified before the United States Congress. I wrote about it in Cosmos. I addressed it in Parade magazine, which at the time reached tens of millions of American households every Sunday. I was not trying to frighten people into paralysis. I was trying to awaken something. The recognition that we had created a danger unlike anything our species had previously confronted, and that the very normalcy of daily life was obscuring its reality. Because that is the most dangerous thing about existential risk. Not that people panic, but that they don't. The groceries still need to be bought. The children still need to go to school. The television still plays its comedies in the evening, and quietly, in hardened silos and on submarines beneath the ocean surface, the weapons wait. If the scale of what I am describing is beginning to settle in you, if this is the kind of reckoning you want to continue, I hope you will subscribe to this channel. There is much further to go. What I found most philosophically unbearable as I studied these systems was not the weapons themselves. It was the discovery of how many times we had nearly used them, not through deliberate decision, but through error, through the catastrophic gap between the complexity of our technology and the limitations of the human beings operating it. In September of 1983, The same year my colleagues and I published our nuclear winter research, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov sat alone in a facility outside Moscow as his early warning system reported an incoming American missile strike. 5 missiles. The protocol was absolute. Report the attack. Initiate retaliatory sequence. Petrov looked at his instruments. I followed protocol. I might not have followed protocol. I might not have written the books I later wrote. You might not exist to read them. I was not aware of this incident when it occurred. Almost no one in the West was. It became public knowledge only years later. And when I learned of it, what struck me was not relief. What struck me was the arithmetic. How many other moments like that one had there been, invisible to history, where the difference between survival and catastrophe was the private judgment of a single exhausted human being? The answer, as declassified records have since revealed, is more than we were ever told. Now I want to address the argument I heard most frequently when I raised these concerns publicly. The argument that deterrence worked, that mutually assured destruction was, in its grim logic, a form of stability, that the very horror of nuclear weapons made their use irrational and therefore predictably unlikely. I understood this argument. I engaged with it seriously. There was a real kernel of truth inside it. The deliberate, premeditated first strike by a rational actor calculating outcomes did appear to be deterred. For that narrow scenario, the logic held. But here is what the deterrence argument consistently failed to account for: human error, institutional failure, the sensor that malfunctions at 3 in the morning, the chain of command that fractures under political crisis, the leader whose judgment deteriorates, the submarine that loses contact with command and whose captain must decide, alone in the dark, with incomplete information and a standing order. I wrote in The Demon-Haunted World that we have arranged a society based on science and technology in which hardly anyone understands anything about science and technology. And we have done something more specific and more dangerous. We have arranged a system of planetary destruction that runs on human reliability, in an institution, in a species that is demonstrably, repeatedly, gloriously unreliable. Deterrence is a theory. The historical record is not a theory. It is a catalog of near misses, and our survival, I concluded, owed less to the elegance of strategic doctrine and far more to luck. To the Petrovs, to the individual human beings who, and in moments of crushing pressure, chose to hesitate. We cannot build a permanent civilization on hesitation. And yet, here is what I also believe, and what I want to offer not as comfort, but as honest assessment. We are still here. Every one of the crises I watched with dread resolved without detonation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Able Archer, the repeated accidents and near misses of the 1970s and 80s. Something in our species, fragile and inconsistent as it is, kept pulling back. I do not think we are saved. I think we are warned. There is a difference. To be saved is to be finished with the danger. To be warned is to understand that the danger is still present, that the weapons still exist, that the architecture of extinction has not been dismantled, and that the difference between survival and catastrophe remains, as it always has been, the quality of our choices. The pale blue dot is not protected by its beauty. It is not sheltered by the indifference of the cosmos. It is held together, such as it is, by the accumulated decisions of conscious beings who understood enough to care. That understanding, Rigorous, honest, unflinching is what I spent my life trying to build. If you are here, I believe you are trying to build it too. This channel exists for that purpose. Science as a practice of orientation, history as a warning we are obligated to hear, and the cosmos as the context that reminds us what is actually at stake. Subscribe if what I have said tonight feels important, not because I am asking, but because you already know that it is. The pale blue dot is still there. So are we. That is not an accident. It is an inheritance. And inheritances carry obligations.